Welcome everybody. So we're going to talk today about how can we find independent variable, dependent variable, control variable, our control group, experimental group. How can we come up with a purpose for our lab? And how can we do that just by looking at an initial lab setup? So first of all, let's look for our variables because after determining our independent variable and our dependent variable from a lab, we can pull out our groups, we can pull out our controls, we can even write our purpose statements and begin a good hypothesis statement. So first of all, let's look at some places where we can usually find information as to what our independent variable in a lab might be. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at our materials. I notice in my materials that I have a plastic cup with distilled water. And I know that I have gummy bears in my lab. So I know that my independent variable is going to have to do something with gummy bears and distilled water. I'm then going to look at my procedure. My procedure is going to also give me a clue as to what my independent and dependent variables are going to be. I'm going to find the clue for my independent variable at the very beginning of my procedure, usually in the first half of my steps. As I go through my steps, of course, I'm going to obtain my materials, write my sticky notes, but let's go right to step 3 where the lab really begins. We're going to obtain the initial weight of our gummy bear. I'm going to keep this in mind for later. Now let's look at our procedure. I'm going to place your gummy bear in the distilled water. This is my clue about my independent variable. Remember, the independent variable is the variable that is manipulated or changed by the experimenter. In this case, what is the experimenter doing? We're putting our gummy bear in the distilled water. That tells me that adding distilled water is my independent variable. I'm going to continue to look through my procedure to get a clue about what my dependent variable might be. As I move down, it says I'm going to place my cup in a directed location. I'm going to wait 24 hours, and this is going to be my clue. I'm going to look at the final parts of my procedure where it says obtain the final weight and make observations of the gummy bear. This is where I am recording information. I'm seeing what happened. Remember, the dependent variable is the results of the experiment. It is our measurable outcomes. And in a procedure, of course, we're going to measure our outcomes at the end of the lab. So we would expect to find our dependent variable down here in procedure, near the last steps. Words that we might look for: measure, observe, count, record, any type of verb that asks us to take in information or record some kind of data. That's going to be our dependent variable. Now that we've identified our independent and dependent variable, we can now go back and look at what our controlled variables are going to be. The controlled variables are going to be the things that would not change in any setup of any part of the experiment. In this case, our plastic cup would be the controlled variable. The brand of gummy bear would need to be controlled because we're only changing the addition of water. Now that we have our independent variable, which is the addition of distilled water, we can go back and we can find our control group and our experimental group. Now in this lab, we only have one gummy bear, but we do make a measurement at the very beginning. we obtain the initial weight of our gummy bear before the water is added. And so I can say that this is my control. My control is my lab setup before or without the variable having been applied to it. Down here at the end, of course, we have our final weight after we have applied the variable, after we put it in water. And so I can say that the gummy bear in the water was our experimental group. Now that we have our independent variable and we have our dependent variable, we can make a purpose statement about this lab. A purpose statement defines what is the intent of this experiment. What are we trying to determine? It's written as a relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Let's go ahead and write one now. I always like to start off my purpose statement. The purpose of this investigation is to determine. This is the best way to start off our purpose statement. It tells us what that we're establishing the purpose. It tells us that it is an investigation and that we are determining something. Now, I'm going to include the independent variable and the dependent variable in my statement. The purpose of this investigation is to determine the effect of adding distilled water to a gummy bear. The purpose of this investigation is to determine the effect of adding distilled water to a gummy bear. Now, this is sort of an okay purpose statement. I've mentioned that we're looking at the effect. I've mentioned adding distilled water, but what am I leaving out? That's right, I'm leaving out the dependent variable. The effect of what? The effect of adding distilled water to the effect of adding distilled water to a gummy bear effect on the weight of adding distilled water to a gummy bear. So we're talking about, right, the effect on what? The effect on the weight of the gummy bear. Let's talk about how to turn that purpose statement into a hypothesis statement. When I turn a hypothesis statement, I'm going to make a prediction about what's going to happen. When I do so, I need to include both my independent and my dependent variable in my hypothesis. I'm going to make sure to tell what I think the connection is between the two variables. A hypothesis should not start with I think or I believe. If you're writing the hypothesis, then it's what you believe. So we can start right in with a statement. The weight of the gummy bear after adding distilled water will. I'm then going to make my prediction, and I'm going to say what it will happen, and then I will add because. And this because is going to include my scientific reasoning as to why I think the outcome will be what it is. If we look back from just this experiment, with the little bit of information it provided, we've been able to pull out the independent variable, the dependent variable, the control variables, both the control group and the experimental group. We've been able to create a purpose statement and take that purpose statement and turn it into the beginning of a good hypothesis statement. Now it's your turn to try.